guest today is Carrie Hahn. She is the author of Beyond Inclusion: How to Raise Anti-Ableist Kids. Carrie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
I would love to start with an introduction. So I thought maybe I could just ask you about your story, your personal story, and your family experience with disability, because so much of that informs what you've written about and the way I think that you tell your story, as well as instructing, maybe for lack of a better word, or guiding the rest of us in how to approach disability in our lives. So yeah, can we start with your story?
Yeah, totally. I'm a speech language pathologist by trade. And so for about 20 years now, that's what I've been doing for my career. And so I have been serving individuals with disabilities. Mostly I've been all in pediatrics. So
Okay.
fast forward some years when I was already the mom of our older son, and we adopted our younger son. And he is blind and he's got multiple disabilities. When we adopted him, the only thing we knew was that he was blind. At the time, I was working at a center that served specifically blind and visually impaired kids. And so that was kind of part of our story when we started thinking about adoption and how we were going to grow our family. He came onto our radar, and it was just kind of instant. Okay, this is our, like, I need to know him. And so when I became his mom, obviously I thought, oh, I've been working with kids with disabilities for all these years. I just know so many things. And I've come to figure out that, not to discount having that foundation, because having that foundation and being in that place was part of my story, right? That it wasn't a brand new thing for me to navigate as a parent, but also how many things I did not already know at the time, and how many things, I have learned and continue to learn in the process of being a parent. And so a few years later, we also found out that our older son has learning disabilities. He has ADHD and dyslexia. And so ironically, I was already the parent of a disabled child. I just didn't know it at the time. And the way that their disabilities manifest and the ways that they affect the way they move in the world are so very different. I found myself in the position a lot of other parents asking me questions about how to relate to my younger son who is blind, kind of wanting to do the right thing, wanting to say the right thing, wanting to be inclusive, but kind of them feeling ill-equipped to do that or not knowing exactly how to do that. And also simultaneously having interactions with people, kind of just observing the ways that he was being treated in the world. I was coming in with the like rose-colored glasses and like the, oh, we can do anything together and we'll support him, and not even realizing how much ableism he would face and how just it's all day, how it's every time we go out into the public. I wanted to learn more about people with disabilities and the ableism that they face, because I wanted to know how I should be responding in those cases as his mom. What's the best way for me to react in these cases? Do I provide education? Do I not? Do I, do I advocate? Yeah. Do I get big and loud, or do I stay quiet? Or what are the best ways? And I thought, well, who better to learn from than people with disabilities themselves, like who I can just start to listen to. And so I started just kind of reading memoirs, listening to content, following, disabled people with whatever information that they were putting out into the world willingly and independently. I just started writing down like commonalities that people were sharing. I just started noticing patterns and like, oh, this is a really common thing that a lot of people report. And long story short, reached out to someone who was a connection of mine in publishing. And she said, not only could this be a book, but this should be a book. And she said, I have little girls, and this is the information that I want. I want to know what to do as a parent, because I want to do better at this, and I want to empower them to, be good friends and neighbors to all, including their community members with disabilities. And so that's why it ended up being a parenting book, in order to affect like a bigger change. I think if we can start with these younger generations, there's going to be some compounding effects of that going forward. But then as you go along, you realize it's just not that simple. You can't just say, oh, well, we'll just, tell people exactly what to say to their kids, and then that's going to make them anti-ableist. It's like, well, those kids are going to have questions, and they're constantly observing and absorbing what's happening in their culture. And so it isn't as simple as just this is just about the kids. It has to be on a personal level. And so that's kind of how my book came to be, was from all these different experiences that kind of just kept stacking on top of each other into a genuine desire to try to make the world better for my kids and other kids than it is now. Just is there anything we can do to move the needle, So
Totally. And we'll get into some examples in a minute, but I thought maybe starting with defining some of the terms, including just disability itself, but
yeah,
also ableism and anti-ableist. Like, just what do you mean by those things?
yeah.
And, how should people be kind of following along with what you're saying?
A theme that's going to run throughout the book and just kind of throughout the disability community in general is just that there isn't one definition, because there's so much diversity within the
Right.
community, the disabled community, in terms of how people define disability themselves, whether or not they identify as disabled, and how they make those decisions about whether or not they identify as disabled. So I indicated certain things in the book and saying this is where I'm coming from, but also hopefully conveying the message of, but I'm not the authority. So in terms of disability in my book, I frame up disability as people with disabilities who would be subject to ableism. Not necessarily that someone has identified as having a disability, but someone who could experience or has reported experiencing ableism. And in terms of disability, I do mostly reference the social model of disability. You kind of can contrast the social model with the medical model. And so a lot of people are more familiar with the medical model,
Sure.
which defines disability as being kind of connected to a problem that needs to be fixed. Sometimes the medical model is necessary because I want to go to a doctor or a specialist if I have something that I do want to be fixed, or
Yeah.
I want a doctor to help me with this, then we need that service to be available. The social model of disability kind of more says that people are more disabled by the limitations that society puts on them. So, for example, lack of access, lack of accommodation, stigma, bias. Those things are more kind of oppressive than the disability itself or the way that their body presents. Kind of going off of the knowledge that disability is like a normal part of the human condition. There are plenty of people that identify as having a disability who don't have anything that they wish to change about themselves. They're not
Right.
looking for a doctor to fix anything or change anything. And that's
Can
why
I
it's
interrupt you for just a second?
sure.
You had a great example, and I can't remember if this had to do with being visually impaired or hearing impaired, but where it was someone who was like, "But don't you miss hearing?" And
Yeah.
you were like, and the person was like, "Don't you miss flying? Like, it's something you've never done, so you don't
Yes.
miss it." Like, I just
Yeah.
loved that little comeback, which again was not rude or mean, but it was just kind of
Yeah.
like, no, I don't, because that's not actually.
Helping someone
Sure, I
connect
might,
with
if I
that.
had been a sighted person and became blind, maybe I would miss it. Sure, but that's not
Yes.
wasn't the situation, and I
Yeah.
just loved that as a great little example.
It kind of goes back to like the individuality of a person's experience, and that's why the individual piece is so important, and kind of a theme throughout the book is that every individual person's experience is going to dictate so many of these factors that we talk about. And so a person who was born blind and has never had vision has had a very different experience than a person who had vision and then
Right.
lost their vision.
Yeah.
When if someone had something and lost it, then there is a grief there.
Yeah. Right.
People don't fit in little neat boxes. Even the boxes that exist, there's even spaces between those boxes. So yeah, I think that's in the book. I kind of try to go into explain a lot of those things. There is a lot of nuance in how much individual factors play into it. Can be kind of like there isn't a definitive answer. It would be a lot easier if everything was straightforward and there was one answer to every question. But that's definitely not the case with this topic.
So I would love to talk a little bit about the way we speak about disability and the ways in which we can perpetuate kind of a um, ableist view through our language. I'd also love to hear about what shifts if we start to use our language differently. Like, why does language matter so much around these things?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you just speak to that a little bit?
I think that we have to be so mindful of whether we're framing up things from a negative place, from a positive place, from a neutral place. And so much of how we talk about disability, it's obviously going to come from the person and how they're viewing it. But that's been one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in myself personally as I've gone along this journey, and as I've moved from someone who did used to kind of view disability as something that was, all the things that now I'm like trying to help people get past. That I was in
Mm,
that place once. I talk about that a lot in the book, that no matter where you are on your journey, it's okay. But when you're coming from a place where you think that disability is sad or tragic or, a negative thing, everything that you talk about is going to come from that place. So your language is probably going to reflect that, your
right.
language that you use, and the way that you talk about someone or talk to them it's probably going to come through. And so I think the biggest thing that I'm trying to accomplish with this book is helping people shift first their kind of perspectives, and then the language that they use will kind of comes along with that.
Hmm.
Um, and I do talk a little bit in the book about like person first, the things like person first language, versus like disability first language, or like
Yep.
where you identify the person, where you might say an autistic person versus a person with autism, or
Hmm.
a disabled person versus a person with a disability. Some people it doesn't matter that much, and some people it matters a great deal. And so that's another thing that can be very individualistic. So the language does matter. In the book, I use both because I want to connect with everybody, and I want to make it clear that regardless of which language you're choosing, I think it's important to honor that. But also, kind of, I lean more toward what the majority is saying, but also trying to make a point of saying, if you're choosing a different way, that's okay, and I will personally honor whatever you want. I talk about asking the person and talking to the person and saying, what are your preferences? It's kind of the same as if we were asking about someone's pronouns, right? If I have to have a reason to identify you, if I'm talking about your disability for some reason, what language would you like for me to use? But I think that a lot of this centers around like agency, and making sure that people feel that they are the one, the disabled person themselves is in control of their own narrative and their own story.
Remember once I was writing about, I was kind of sharing a post from someone who referred to themselves as a person with autism, and
Mm-hmm.
so I did the same in sharing the post.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else who did not read the post commented on it that I was supposed to say autistic person,
Mm-hmm.
not person with autism. And I was like, well, I was going based on what they
Yeah.
said about themselves. And I think other people from the outside looking in, that those are the types of things that can prompt either cynicism of
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my gosh, like this is just language police. Could we
Yeah.
please just move on to more important items?
Yeah.
Or despair. There's
Yeah.
absolutely no way I can ever get this right. And I'm
Yeah.
only going to hurt people no matter what I do. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about that? Like that kind of like, I got to throw up my hands either because I feel cynical about it or because I feel hopeless about it.
I feel like that, earlier on in my journey, that felt almost like, and like I couldn't even hardly stand it because I felt like I was just getting it wrong all the time.
Yeah.
Or of course defensiveness kind of comes up. And I think it takes a long time of just focusing on humbling yourself and saying, this is like, I'm going to try to stay in this space, even if I feel like I might be getting it wrong. I want to continue to listen. If I do get it wrong, I want to take a beat and say, you got it wrong, but that's okay. As long as you're continuing to try to move forward, that urge to kind of get defensive will definitely create like separation. It will
Mhm.
cause like the rifts and the tension. And I think that it's been, I don't exactly know what it was, but there's been this like shift in me that has like softened me a little bit to kind of appreciate if somebody does call me out, and saying, rather than saying, well, this, you said this, and,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
more like a thank you for telling me about that, because I can learn from this.
Mhm.
And I've also learned that there often isn't a way that you can, like in your case, you defaulted to the person, someone else came. There might not be a way that you can always get it right,
Right.
but that's okay, because as long as there's that commitment to, I care about you as the person that I'm communicating with more than I care about the fact that I got called out. And
Right.
if I misspoke, I apologize. Or this miscommunication, let me explain where it came from. And you still might not be happy with me, but I am invested in the connection and making sure that if there is something to be learned, or if there is somewhere where I can grow from this, that I am growing from this, so that whoever I'm interacting with knows that I'm open to, that I want to be open to connection, rather than like who's right, who's wrong,
Mhm.
um, and who's the person in this space who I should, like, should I be the default, or should this other person, um, and that can shift from time to time. And ultimately we have to end up standing where we stand. And sometimes wherever we stand may not resonate with everybody. But as long as, I feel like if you've humbled yourself, and you're practicing, you're trying to like practice being open and connected, and willing to learn from people, and trying to get out of defensiveness, I think it really can help us grow a lot. So it's not an easy thing. It's like an ongoing thing,
Yeah.
and where I started could be that if that happened, I would shut down, and I would step away from, that group or whatever it is. I would have to step away, and I'd be swirling in my own head about it, because it was shame. It was me,
Mm.
like, ashamed that I didn't get it right. And this process has kind of taught me, not getting it right isn't something to be ashamed of, as long as you're continuing to try to learn how to get it right, and that you're continuing to try to learn how to do right by the people that you are with, representing, um, just the situation, the moment, the person, the community, um, saying, this moment might teach me something, and that will help me do better in the next moment. um, that, I think, that idea of everything being a process, and
Yeah.
like that you can take good from everything, every interaction that you have.
Well, so what about experiences, and you write about a number of these where people approach your son Dan with good intentions,
Mm-hmm.
but problematic assumptions. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'd love to kind of walk us through that, because we've talked a little bit about language, which extends to what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, but also sometimes people who are like, quote unquote, offering to help or giving
Yeah.
a compliment.
Yep.
You give some
Yep.
great stories, and I just wondered if you could share one of those examples, and also how you handled it and what you think about it now.
Yeah. Well, so like I think my very first story that I share in the book is it's from the chapter about the presumption of competence, or the presumption of incompetence, since every chapter is like a form of ableism.
Yeah.
And so when he was in kindergarten, we adopted him when he would have been in his last year of preschool. So he had only been home for about a year, a little over a year, probably, about when this happened. I'd picked him up. I was picking him up from his after school program, and he was changing from his boots into his shoes, because we live in a snowy place. And so I was just standing there waiting for him to put his shoes on. And there was a parent nearby who had a child who was in the same like program, class,
Yeah.
or whatever. And the parent looked over at him, and then looked at me and said, "He's amazing." And I was like very early on in this, but I was far enough along to be like, that hit me in a way that it didn't feel great, but I knew that he was coming from a good place. And I wasn't sure exactly what to say in that
Hmm.
moment. And I just said, "You are pretty amazing, aren't you, Dan?" Because I also was like, I don't want you to talk to him. Don't talk to me. I knew enough about that I was like, let's not talk about him. Like, let's talk. So I said, "You are pretty amazing, aren't you?" And he just got really still for a second. And like when he's thinking hard, that's what he does. His body just freezes. And I know that he's thinking. He got really still, and he said, "I'm an amazing piano player, right, Mom?" And I was like, he is an amazing piano player. And so it was so powerful for me to like to go through that and get his perspective on that situation. I think that was the first time I ever got feedback about how he was perceiving the situation.
Yeah.
And he was like, he hears the word amazing and he's thinking, what makes me amazing?
Right.
It's that
Oh,
I
the
can play the
piano.
piano. Right.
Not my boots.
He's not like, surely he's not talking about me putting my shoes on, like, and I talk in the book about how, like, for some, putting their shoes on might be a really big deal.
Yeah.
When he learned how to first put his shoes on, that was a big deal. But when it comes to disability and ableism, kind of from a broader perspective, the presumption of incompetence is basically like, he's blind, so he probably can't do anything,
Right.
like,
Right.
he's blind, so the fact that he's sitting there putting on his shoes without your help is miraculous, when there were other kids nearby and they weren't amazing, even though they were the same age as him. That's an ongoing thing that I honestly feel like I'm still not even really sure sometimes how to handle, because he's at the age now, he's 12, and he doesn't have a whole lot of patience. He has gotten kind of tired of kids asking him, why are your eyes closed? He's at the point right now where that really kind of annoys him. And so we just had a situation the other day where it was like a little girl that we know personally, we know the family, but we don't spend a lot of time with them. And so she asked, and he said, "Oh, can you please not ask me that?" And it feels awkward, because then I'm like, okay, what am I doing here? Like, I don't want this little girl to feel bad. She probably doesn't understand what's happening. Then the dad was like, oh, sorry, sorry, sorry. And I'm like, nobody has to be sorry.
Right.
Where I asked him, Dan, I said, is it okay if I answer the question, or would you prefer that I don't answer the question? He's like, you can answer. And so then I just briefly said, he's blind. He doesn't use his eyes, so his eyes stay closed. So me also trying to navigate his agency and personhood, and that he gets to decide if somebody isn't entitled to that information, he can say, no, it's none of your business. He actually went through a phase where he was like, Google it. And so he ended up saying, Google it to this. And I was like, well, honey, she's like in kindergarten, so I don't know if she can Google it, but it's like, I don't ever feel like I'm handling it right. But some of these things are a little bit messy. And I think everybody, you just do the best you can in the situation. And my hope, another part of the hope for this book, was that if more people just get out there and learn a little bit more, if they just kind of open themselves up and they want to learn about disability just on like a basic level, just some basic education. If kids are being read stories about disability, right, then maybe less kids will say, why are your eyes closed? Or, like, if more kids have had a little bit of information given to them, then maybe they've got enough to where they're like, oh, I remember reading, he's blind, he's using a cane, he's blind, so there's no need to ask the question. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's not like it's ever going to go away, because the kids are different ages, and so
and I'm wondering from that, and you've said a few of these, but like whether there are ever any kind of overarching principles or guideposts for people who are not trying to get it perfect, but also want to learn more, to speak differently, to kind of live in the world a little bit differently when it comes to disability. I'm thinking of like a mom who wants to invite a child from their child's class and knows that that child has a disability, but doesn't know how to talk to the other mom about having them come over, something like that, where it's like, are there any kind of guiding thoughts or principles? You've named like reading books. I mean, again, I think that is a great source of information, whether that's children's books with our kids or, just going online and Googling it. But are there other things you would offer?
In the book, I talk a little bit about how I think that talking about accessibility and accommodation, just starting to make it part of our general practice, not necessarily we're going to talk about access and accommodation because I know this person has a disability, which clearly, that's a good time to talk about it. But I've started, like, if I'm having any sort of an event, or like if I'm doing anything, I kind of have started to try to just make a blanket, like, to all the participants, saying, if there are any access or accommodation needs that you have that would make you more comfortable at this event, please let me know. So then there might be people with hidden disabilities, that you don't even think to ask. Like, there's kids in your class, if they look typical, but they might have needs that they might have something that would help them be more successful at the party, but no one ever asks them because it's a hidden disability. So but when you know for sure, like in our case, I've had several parents that will reach out to me and say, we'd like to invite him to her birthday party. Here's what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
What does he need? So it's kind of like in the book, I talk about just kind of a basic of reaching out and saying, we want to invite your
Yeah.
child. Here's the activity. Here's what will be expected. Here's what we'll be doing, whatever. And then is there anything that we can do to make sure that if they want to come, that they would be more comfortable or be better able to participate? Leaving that open. So then you're letting the other person know this is a priority to me. We want to make sure your child can participate, but I'm not exactly sure what to do. And that's I think ideal because of the nature of everybody's disability being different. People can guess, but like I've had people who take steps and do things based on, kind of a more blanket identification of what might be helpful to someone with visual impairment or blindness. But then because of Dan's individuality, it ends up wasted because he's not like into that thing or whatever. You know what I
Mm.
mean? And so people spend a lot of time and effort trying to make something accessible, but on a universal design level, if you can change stuff and make it accessible for everyone, that's great ongoing. But if we're talking about kind of a one-time
Right.
thing, I think it's better to check in because you may put all that effort and it might not actually still be a good match for the person. People brailing things for Dan is really important, but it depends on what it is because he does not like to read. And so if someone puts in all this effort to braille something that's long, he's probably not going to actually use it. So, but in terms of if it's something like shorter, like an invitation, that's great, and then I'm trying with Dan to empower him to be able to kind of advocate for his own, like there's a fine line there. He's a kid, so he shouldn't have to be doing a ton of work to advocate for
Yeah.
himself. His
Yeah.
his support team should be doing a lot of that without him requiring it. But as he gets older, he's going to need to know how to do that too. So understanding what his access needs are and then being comfortable enough to like share them with others or speak up for them when he chooses to or when he wants to.
Totally. What about like I'm thinking about some of the scenarios again. The book. Do you remember how many chapters it is?
15.
15 chapters, and each one has a different one of these assumptions or stereotypes or
Yep. Yep.
ways of speaking or thinking, and
Mm-hmm.
you give stories and also just similar to what we're talking about here, so just so people
Yeah.
have a sense of the book. But I wanted to just kind of zoom in on a couple of those,
Yeah.
just to give some more examples, and I think some of the things that people might encounter the most. One is like, and we got at this a little bit with the amazing story, but why is it
Mm-hmm.
problematic to see disabled people as inspirational? What?
Yeah. It's so some out there might be familiar with the work of Stella Young. Stella Young kind of was the first person to talk a lot about this form of ableism. There's a couple different messages that it kind of sends. One is that you exist to inspire me. So your
Right.
whole life is about inspiring me, which has its own problems. The person is here for the same reasons that all of us are here. If they happen to be inspirational for different reasons, all of us have the potential to inspire, but when it comes to disability, there seems to be a very specific form of that, which is problematic. um, the other reason why it's problematic is because she said something to the effect of, no matter how bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be
Mm,
that person. And then she says, but what if you are that person? And so it's when people use inspiration, when they talk or they frame up people with disabilities as
mm,
inspirational, they'll often do things like, oh, well, I'm never going to complain again. I have it so easy and I have it so good because look, there's that
mm.
disabled person over there who just has such a
Yeah.
pitiful existence. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. It's telling a story about someone that isn't necessarily true. I'm sure there are people that have a pitiful existence, but it's not necessarily because there's a lot of reasons why someone could be struggling or having a hard time, right?
Yeah, sure.
Sometimes it is true that facets of their disability are causing them a hard time, and sometimes it's not true at all.
Yeah.
But there's a blanket application to the disabled community that tends to do that and basically kind of say, I'm inspired by you because you get up every day and you brush your teeth and you go to work. And it's like, but why is that so inspirational? That's what all of us do.
Yeah.
I think I talk in the book about how, like, if you've always walked on two legs, then you imagine that if you used a wheelchair, that it would be so hard,
Right.
right?
Right.
When someone's learning to use a wheelchair, it's probably hard at first. There's a learning curve. There's going to be things they have to learn.
Yeah.
But once that's established, then it isn't hard,
Right.
unless things like people parking in the access lane and they can't access
Right.
their
Right.
ramp, or when buildings are inaccessible. Again, kind of going back to that social model, the things that society puts on them that make their life hard. But their life innately as a disabled person isn't, that doesn't automatically make this person's life so hard.
I
So,
remember this day in elementary school, and I can't remember if it was called, I think it was called Colonial Day or something like that. And the idea was that we would live like the colonial times. So
mm-hmm.
we couldn't turn on lights and we couldn't, use electricity at all was
Yeah,
the big one.
yeah,
And I just remember even as a kid being like, this is so dumb because they had candles and
yeah,
oil lamps and like they had essentially what we now in disability speak would call accommodations for
yes,
not having electricity, which of course they didn't know they didn't have. And like,
yes,
no, they didn't have cars, but they did have like other ways of transportation, or they had stores that were closer because like
yes,
it just was like our society is structured around electricity. So of course it's
yes,
hard for us not to have it today.
yep,
And I think that's really similar to what you're
yes,
saying, where it's like
totally.
you do actually accommodate yourselves. I mean, that's one of the actual wonders. Oh, this is so cool. I was just reading a book called The Disability History of the United States, which has its opening chapters about Native Americans and how
Mm-hmm.
most native languages do not have a term that is the equivalent of the English word disability,
Mm-hmm.
because of the people were seen in just different terms. Like they were seen relationally, they were seen as a part of the whole. And so
A wide contingency of ability, and a person's, what their
contribution
body
is
looks
not,
like,
yeah.
how they use their body, that we don't have to identify or single out, because the community as a whole is everyone, and there's a range and we all
Yeah.
fit somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thank you for that. I appreciate that kind of explanation and those thoughts. Well, I'm kind of, as we come to a close here, I'm thinking, this is a podcast called Reimagining the Good Life. And
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that your experience with both of your sons
Mm-hmm.
has allowed some thinking and reimagining, in fact, around
Yes.
this idea of like what makes life good, what is
Yeah.
the purpose, the meaning, all of that. So I just wanted to ask you to share with us a little bit about how your experience has changed your own understanding of what the good life is and kind of an
Yeah.
imagination for that.
Totally. I mean, in like the most incredible way. It's so fascinating because you can have a journey. One of your podcast episodes, you talk about how we live in a spiral and
Yeah.
how we spiral up. And
Mhm.
that caught my attention, because I was like, yes, this journey, you go through times that are harder, and then you take a lap around. And when you get back to another point that feels hard again, you realize that you're not in the same place, and
Yeah.
it doesn't feel the same. It might still feel hard, but it's not the same. It's not as hard as it was. And that journey has been, so hugely transformational with my boys, and where you can start in terms of being so afraid to be outside of the norm. Like when we adopted Dan, clearly we knew he was blind, and we knew that he existed outside of, the norm, whatever
Hmm.
that is. These standards that we set up that we want to try to kind of shove everybody into. And I think I didn't realize how much I was going to have to come to terms with what that means to be outside of that, and
Mm.
all that being inside or outside of the norm encompasses. And what it's made me do over time is it's made me really see my kids for who they are, like at their core. Like,
Mm.
who God made them to be and who they are. And it's made me need to get like not only innately personal with that, but also fiercely defend that and do everything that I possibly can to make sure that they are valued as they are. You know, some of that, then you start to put it back on yourself and you have to do your own work and say, hey, look, it looks like I have some things I need to work on. And then you end up in a place where you can accept yourself in all of your intricacies and all of your flaws, because you're working so hard to figure out how to do it for your kids. You end up maybe being able to do it for yourself. And then it transfers out to a wider community. And I feel like you start to be able to see people differently, just
Yeah.
regardless of where they are or who they are, or you just see people as humans who have innate worth, that it like where it doesn't matter if they what box they fit into or if they fit into a box. And maybe even more so when you see the people who don't fit into the box and are marginalized, you develop even more of a heart for them and wanting to try to do whatever you can to make sure they have a place and that they can find the peace and the joy that they should be having access to.
Mm.
I just feel like it has reframed, reimagined, you know, the what it is that I want from life, and that what I think we should be getting from life, and just priorities have shifted so dramatically. What's important, like what actually really matters, that I would answer that question so differently now than I would 10 years ago, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so that it's all just been so good, where the person that I am now and the way that I see people, not just my kids, not just people with disabilities, but just people in general, has shifted to a point where I feel like love and grace are the things that I'm defaulting to first. And that's the person I've always prayed to want to become, you know?
Hmm.
And I feel like the process of getting is trying to get closer and closer to that just is the good, is like the best life I could have imagined, you know, is feeling that peace and feeling uh, innate love for people with ease, not where it's not hard and you don't have to try really hard to just love
Yeah.
people, you know?
Mm.
That's where I feel like this journey has brought me. And I'm so much happier with this life, you know? I mean, I wouldn't go back and trade the different parts of my life for, you know, for what I have now, because what I have now, I'm really, really grateful for.
Mm. Well, that's a beautiful place, I think, to end this conversation, because it does speak to the fact that, sure, we can talk about, using the right words and wanting to have this right posture, but what's really happening in us through that process is a development of the heart that actually is not like restricting it and saying only these things are okay, but actually expanding it, and bringing us like a different sense of self and a different sense of the kind of beauty and wonder of these humans that we get to interact with all the time. So thank
Yes.
you
Yes.
for
Thank you
helping
so
us
much.
on that journey.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for having me.